Hello, and welcome back to Echo of the Night. If you're tuning in tonight, you're in for a story that might make you think twice about the next time you order a pizza. Let me know where you're listening from, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying these eerie tales. Tonight's story is about a young man named Adam, just like any of us, trying to make a living, working a job that pays the bills. For Adam, that job was delivering pizza. It's a simple enough gig, nothing out of the ordinary. You take the order, you drive, you deliver. But as with all stories that are truly unforgettable, it's the little things that make the difference. It was just another Wednesday evening when Adam clocked in for his shift at the local pizzeria. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the faint smell of tomato sauce and cheese lingering in the air. The kitchen was a familiar chaos of dough being stretched, toppings being scattered, and the sound of the oven timer going off every few minutes. "Here you go, Adam," his manager Rick said, handing him a steaming pizza box. "A large pepperoni for 221 Birchwood Street. You're on the road again." "Thanks, Rick," Adam replied, grabbing the box and sliding into his jacket. He grabbed his keys and headed for his car, his mind already on the simple drive ahead. The evening air was cool, the streets relatively empty for a Wednesday. It wasn't a busy night, and Adam enjoyed the peace. The rhythmic sound of his car's engine was comforting as he drove through the familiar neighborhood, a route he had taken hundreds of times before. The street lights flickered faintly as he passed, casting long shadows on the pavement. Terran drew deep. Birchwood Street was just a few blocks away from the pizzeria. The houses were modest, lined with tall, overgrown hedges, their lawns untended. Nothing unusual. He'd been down this street plenty of times before. But tonight, something felt different. He pulled up to the house at 221 Birchwood Street, the address marked on his delivery slip. It was a two-story home, nestled in the corner of the block, its porch light dim and flickering. As he walked up to the door, Adam noticed something strange. The porch was empty, no cars in the driveway, no signs of life. Just a quiet, dark house standing still. He shrugged it off. It wasn't uncommon for people to be out at this hour, especially on a Wednesday night. He rang the doorbell and waited. The seconds stretched longer than they should have. A faint creak sounded from inside and the door slowly opened, revealing a man standing just beyond the threshold. His features were obscured by the dim light, but there was something about his stance that made Adam uneasy. "Delivery?" Adam asked, trying to sound casual, though a slight unease settled in his chest. The man nodded but didn't say anything. He simply reached out, taking the pizza from Adam's hands without a word. Adam couldn't help but notice the man's cold, distant gaze, his eyes almost, too still. "Thanks," the man muttered, his voice low and clipped. Adam nodded, turning to leave, but as he did, the man spoke again. "You're sure you're not forgetting something?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Adam froze. He turned back, puzzled. "What do you mean?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped back slightly, his shadow stretching across the doorframe. "Don't forget to lock the door on your way out." Adam's heart skipped a beat. The comment didn't make sense, but there was something in the way the man said it, something off. He couldn't shake the feeling that the air around him had grown heavier, thicker. He forced a smile, trying to shake off the unease. As Adam walked back to his car, he couldn't help but glance back at the house. The man stood motionless in the doorway, watching him leave, his face still hidden in shadow. Once Adam was in his car, he sighed, trying to brush off the strange encounter. He drove back to the pizzeria, the normal rhythm of his night slowly settling back into place. But that unsettling feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. As he pulled into the parking lot, he parked his car and grabbed the next delivery order from Rick. It was another simple run. But as Adam stepped out of his car, something caught his eye. A figure standing at the edge of the parking lot, half hidden by the shadows. The man from 221 Birchwood Street. Adam froze, his pulse quickening. How was he here? How had he gotten to the pizzeria so fast? Before he could process the situation, the man turned and disappeared into the darkness. Adam blinked, confused, his heart pounding. He looked around the lot, but the man was gone, leaving only the faintest trace of his presence. "Everything okay, Adam?" Rick asked, looking at him with a puzzled expression. "Yeah," Adam replied, shaking his head. "Just thought I saw something." Rick gave him a questioning look but didn't press further. Adam stood there for a moment longer, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. But as the minutes passed, the unease began to fade. It was probably just his mind playing tricks on him, right? The rest of the night passed uneventfully. Adam finished his shift, went home and tried to relax. But the feeling, the cold, unsettling sensation, stayed with him, gnawing at his thoughts. What had happened tonight? Why did it feel like he was being watched? And who was that man? Little did Adam know, this was only the beginning. The next day came and went in the usual fashion. Adam went about his daily routine, trying to shake off the strange events of the night before. He couldn't explain why, but something about that encounter on Birchwood Street had left a mark on him. The man's unsettling gaze, the cryptic words, and the feeling of being watched. It all lingered, like a shadow he couldn't escape. He tried to push it aside, focusing on his job and the familiar rhythm of his life. The routine of his deliveries, the hum of his car engine, and the chatter at the pizzeria. These were things that kept his mind occupied, but there was a nagging thought, like a low hum in the back of his mind, that wouldn't let him rest. Concentrating on the thought, the evening rolled around, and Adam found himself heading back to work. As he grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, he glanced at his reflection in the hallway mirror. His eyes looked tired, a bit haunted, but he tried to shake it off. He wasn't going to let something as trivial as a strange encounter mess with his head. The pizzeria was as busy as usual, the kitchen bustling with activity, the sound of pizza boxes being stacked, and the occasional clink of coins in the cash register. Adam greeted Rick, grabbed his delivery slip, and was about to head out when he saw a familiar face. A young woman, sitting alone at a table, scrolling through her phone. "Hey, Rachel," Adam said, offering a small smile. Rachel was a regular at the pizzeria, a friendly face who always seemed to be around when Adam was working. She waved back and looked up from her phone. "Hey, Adam, how's it going?" "Good, just another night," he replied, trying to keep his tone light. He wasn't sure why, but talking to Rachel always made him feel a little better. Her easygoing nature was a welcome distraction from the unease that had been plaguing him. "Well, hope it's a busy one for you. The more tips the better, right?" Rachel laughed, her voice cheerful. Adam chuckled, but the laughter felt hollow in his chest. "Yeah, that's the idea." As he turned to leave, Rachel called out to him. "Hey, Adam, be careful tonight, okay? I heard some weird things about Birchwood Street." Adam froze, his heart skipped a beat. Birchwood Street? He turned back slowly, trying to mask the anxiety creeping into his voice. "What kind of weird things?" Rachel lowered her voice, glancing around as if making sure no one was listening. "I don't know, exactly. Just people saying strange things have been happening over there lately, like sightings, people disappearing, stuff like that." No. Adam's blood ran cold. He forced a smile, though it felt tight on his face. "I've been down there plenty of times. I'm sure it's nothing." Rachel gave him a skeptical look but didn't press further. "Well, if you say so, just be careful." The unease settled in again as Adam left the pizzeria. the weight of her words hanging in the air. Birchwood Street. That was where he had delivered the pizza last night, where he had encountered the strange man. The same street Rachel had just mentioned. Was there something more to that encounter? Was it just a coincidence? He shook his head, trying to focus on the road ahead, the familiar streets, the humor of his car, the usual sense of calm. It should have been enough to ease his mind, but as he turned onto Birchwood Street, the same eerie sensation from the night before crept back into his chest. The houses seemed darker tonight, their shadows stretching long and ominous across the pavement. Adam slowed down as he approached 221 Birchwood Street, his eyes scanning the quiet house. There it was again, the unsettling feeling, like someone was watching him. His heart beat faster as he glanced at the porch. The lights were out this time, and the house appeared completely still, devoid of any life. He parked across the street, watching for a moment. Nothing moved. The house seemed abandoned, yet something about it felt. Taking a deep breath, Adam grabbed the pizza and walked up to the door, trying to shake off the creeping dread that threatened to take over. He rang the doorbell and waited. This time there was no creak, no slow opening of the door. Just silence. He rang the bell again, but still, no answer. A knot tightened in his stomach. He turned to leave, but as he did, he heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the shadows of the porch. It was a voice, low and hoarse. "Don't leave." Adam's pulse quickened. He spun around, but the porch was empty. There was no sign of the man from the night before. The whisper had come from nowhere. His heart raced as he looked around, but there was no one in sight. The street was eerily quiet, not even the sound of a passing car. His breath came in shallow gasps as he backed away from the door, his feet stumbling slightly as he turned to leave. But just as he reached his car, something caught his eye. The front door of 221 Birchwood Street was slightly ajar, as if someone had just left it open, or perhaps had been watching him from inside. He didn't wait to find out. He climbed into his car, slammed the door shut, and sped away, his mind racing with 1,000 questions he couldn't answer. Why had he heard that whisper? Who had been inside the house? And why did it feel like someone was always just one step behind him? As Adam drove, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. In fact, it only intensified. His eyes darted to the rear-view mirror, expecting to see something, anything lurking in the shadows behind him. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching ahead. When he pulled into the parking lot of the pizzeria, he parked quickly and rushed inside, desperate to shake the feeling of unease that clung to him like a second skin. "Everything okay?" Rick asked, noticing Adam's disheveled appearance. "Mail, just." "Not a good night," Adam muttered, trying to calm his racing thoughts. But deep down, he knew that something was terribly wrong. He couldn't explain it, but the feeling was there, gnawing at him, making it impossible to ignore. The night passed in a haze of unease. Adam couldn't sleep, his mind constantly drifting back to the strange encounter on Birchwood Street. The whisper, the open door, the feeling of being watched. It all replayed in his head, like a haunting echo that wouldn't fade. No matter how hard he tried to distract himself, the image of the house, with its dark windows and silent porch, lingered. The next morning, Adam awoke with a headache, his thoughts muddled and heavy. He had barely managed to sleep for a few hours, and the weight of exhaustion made everything feel more surreal. The sun was already high in the sky, casting a warm light through the blinds, but it did little to lift his spirits. He pulled himself out of bed, forcing himself through the motions of his usual routine. Shower. Coffee. A quick glance at his phone, checking for any new messages. But there was nothing. Just the usual work notifications, nothing out of the ordinary. Despite the outward calm, his thoughts kept drifting back to Birchwood Street. What was going on there? Who had been in that house? And what did the man want from him? It felt like he was missing something important, a piece of the puzzle that refused to fall into place. Why? By the time evening came, Adam had convinced himself that he was just overthinking it. Maybe the man from the night before was simply a prankster, or someone who'd had a little too much to drink. The whisper? Probably just his imagination running wild. After all, the mind could play tricks when it was tired and on edge. But as he drove to work that evening, the unease returned. The streets felt emptier than usual, the air thicker, like something was lurking just out of sight. The moment he turned onto Birchwood Street, his heart skipped a beat. The house at 221 Birchwood Street was still there, standing like a dark sentinel at the edge of the road. He could feel it again, the weight of eyes upon him. It was as if the house itself was watching him, waiting for him to return. But this time, something was different. As he drove past the house, Adam noticed a figure standing in the front yard, just at the edge of the porch. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by the shadow of the porch light. For a moment, Adam couldn't tell if it was the same man from the night before, but something about the way he stood there, motionless, made his blood run cold. Adam quickly looked away, focusing on the road ahead. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white. He didn't know why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled toward that house, like a moth to a flame. The urge to stop, to turn around, was almost overwhelming, but he resisted it. Instead, he forced himself to keep driving, to push through the discomfort, but the feeling of dread only grew stronger, gnawing at him with every mile. It was as if the shadows of Birchwood Street were closing in, wrapping themselves around him, and he couldn't escape. You may descend on the streets and encourage unwilling passers-by and trap them inside. By the time he arrived at the pizzeria, Adam's nerves were frayed. Rick looked up as Adam walked in, his expression concerned. "Hey man, you look like you've seen a ghost. Everything okay?" Adam forced a smile, though it felt unnatural. "Yeah, just a rough night." "Rough night?" Rick raised an eyebrow. "What happened?" said Sherman. "I don't know, just weird stuff?" Adam shrugged, not sure how to explain it. He didn't want to sound paranoid or delusional. It was just a feeling, a sense of something being off, and he couldn't shake it. Rick didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press the issue. "Well, if you need to talk, you know where I am." Adam nodded, though he didn't think talking about it would help. The feeling wasn't something he could explain, not even to himself. It was like a presence, a weight that followed him everywhere he went. That night, the orders came in as usual, the rhythm of the pizzeria familiar and comforting. But even as he worked, the unease remained, hovering just beneath the surface. He found himself glancing at the clock more often than usual, counting down the minutes until he could leave and put the night behind him. It wasn't until the last delivery of the evening that things truly took a turn. 3. Adam grabbed the pizza, the delivery slip in his hand, and walked out the door. He wasn't sure why, but he felt an odd pull toward Birchwood Street again. The streets were quiet, the moonlight casting long shadows across the pavement, and Adam found himself turning onto the familiar road before he even realized it. He drove slowly, his headlights illuminating the dark houses as he passed, but when he reached 221 Birchwood Street, he couldn't stop himself. He pulled over, parking across the street from the house. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the dark windows, the empty porch. For a moment, nothing moved. The house stood still, silent in the night. But then, just as Adam was about to drive away, he saw it. a shadow in one of the windows. A figure standing just behind the glass, watching him. Adam's breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, but Adam could feel its gaze on him, cold and calculating. He quickly started the car, his hands trembling as he drove away, but the image of that shadow lingered in his mind like a stain that wouldn't wash away. When he arrived back at the pizzeria, his mind was racing. The feeling of being watched, the shadow in the window. It was all too much. Something was happening, something that he couldn't explain, and it terrified him. As he sat in the empty parking lot, staring at the dark street ahead, Adam couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that someone, or something, was always just behind him, waiting for the right moment to make its move. Glenn calculated that, "Let me know if you'd like any changes, or if you're ready for the next part." Adam couldn't get the image of the shadow out of his mind, the figure behind the window at 221 Birchwood Street. It felt real, but in a way that was too unreal to fully comprehend. He tried to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks, that the long hours, the fatigue, and the stress of his routine had finally caught up with him. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. He finally gathered up his courage, his growing callousness. Adam leaned back on his heels and groped his mind. The next day, he went about his work with a hollow sense of routine. His body moved through the motions, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the dark house across the street, or the figure lurking in the shadows. But nothing happened. The day passed without incident, and for a moment, he dared to hope that it had all been a figment of his imagination. But as evening fell and the shadows stretched long across the streets, that sense of unease crept back in. He tried to focus on the orders coming in at the pizzeria, but every time the phone rang, his stomach churned. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him. Rick noticed his distraction. "You're not yourself tonight, man," he said, setting down a stack of pizza boxes. "Everything okay?" Adam forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired. It's been a long week." Rick raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Well, don't let it get to you. You're looking a little pale too. Maybe you should take a break or something." But Adam couldn't. The pull to Birchwood Street was stronger than ever, like an invisible thread drawing him back to the house. He needed answers, even if he wasn't sure what those answers were. And no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the thought of the shadow in the window haunted him. That night after his shift, Adam found himself driving down the familiar road again. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with each passing moment, the weight of dread pressing on his chest. When he reached 221 Birchwood Street, he parked across the street, as he had the night before. This time, though, he didn't hesitate. He got out of the car, the cool night air biting at his skin as he walked toward the house. The porch light flickered above him, casting eerie shadows on the lawn. The house stood silent, its windows dark and empty. For a moment, Adam stood there, staring at it, trying to muster the courage to move closer. He had no idea why he felt compelled to go inside. The door was wide open, just like it had been the night he'd first encountered the man. But tonight, there was no one standing in the doorway. No figure to greet him. Just an empty silence that seemed to swallow everything around it. He hesitated, but only for a moment. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, his footsteps soft on the cracked pavement. The front door was ajar, just like before, and he pushed it open cautiously. The air inside the house was thick with dust, and the faint scent of mildew hung in the air. The house was just as empty as it had appeared from the outside. There was no sign of life, no evidence of anyone living there. The furniture was old, covered in sheets, and everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. The silence was suffocating, and yet there was something unsettling about the stillness. It felt wrong. Adam walked through the house slowly, his footsteps echoing through the rooms. The furniture, the faded wallpaper, the old paintings on the walls. It all seemed frozen in time, as if the house had been abandoned for years. But there was no sign of decay, no signs of neglect. It was as if the house had simply been left, waiting for someone to find it. He moved through the rooms, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, as he reached the staircase at the back of the house, he froze. There, at the top of the stairs, was a door. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack he could see a faint light. It was warm and inviting, but it also felt like something was wrong. Something was waiting on the other side. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the door. He could feel his pulse quicken, his breath shallow. The house felt alive now, as if it were breathing, waiting for him to make a decision. Against his better judgment, Adam took a step forward. He could hear the floorboards creak beneath his weight as he ascended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the door opened slowly. Inside was a small room, almost like a study. The walls were lined with bookshelves, the shelves filled with old books and trinkets. The light in the room came from a single lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. But it wasn't the room that caught his attention. It was the window. The window was wide open, and the cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the sounds of the street below. But, as Adam stepped closer to the window, he noticed something strange. There, just beyond the glass, was the reflection of a figure standing in the yard. It was the same man from the night before. Adam's heart skipped a beat, and his breath caught in his throat. The figure was standing just outside the window, his face still obscured by the shadow of the porch light. He was staring at Adam, his presence suffocating, like a dark cloud that had descended upon him. Before Adam could react, the figure stepped forward, disappearing into the darkness beyond the window. But Adam couldn't tear his eyes away. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. His will be fulfilled if the conditions of his sacrifice were met. He backed away from the window, his mind racing. The door behind him creaked, and Adam spun around, his body stiff with fear. The door to the room had closed on its own, locking him inside. The room was no longer empty. There was a voice, soft and almost inaudible, whispered from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice echoed through the room, its words sending a chill down Adam's spine. He froze, his eyes darting around the dimly lit space. There was no one there. The room was empty, save for the dust-covered bookshelves and the faint light from the lamp. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was closer now, though Adam couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to come from all around him, filling the room with an oppressive weight. His breath quickened, and his heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct told him to run, to leave the house and never look back. But his feet were frozen to the floor, his body paralyzed by fear. The air in the room grew heavier, thicker, as if something unseen was pressing in on him from all sides. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, creeping toward him like tendrils of darkness. Adam could feel the weight of their presence, the oppressive sense of being watched, even though he couldn't see anyone. He took a shaky step back, his pulse racing. The door behind him was still shut tight, the handle unmoving as if it were locked by some unseen force. Panic began to rise in his chest, and he tried to push it down, tried to focus on finding a way out. But the more he looked around, the more the shadows seemed to close in on him. "You've disturbed something," the voice whispered again, the words curling around him like a fog. "Now you must face the consequences." Yes. Adam's mind raced. The consequences? What consequences? What was this place, and why did it feel like the house itself was alive, aware of his every movement? No time to think about it. He turned to the window, desperate for an escape, but when he reached the sill, his stomach dropped. The figure was there again, standing just outside the glass. His face was still hidden in shadow, but Adam could feel his gaze, cold and suffocating, boring into him. The man didn't move, but there was something in his presence, something unspoken, that made Adam's skin crawl. The longer he stared at the figure, the more the room seemed to warp and twist around him, the walls breathing in time with his frantic heartbeat. Suddenly the man's face appeared in the reflection of the glass. His features were distorted, flickering like a malfunctioning television screen, but there was no mistaking the malevolent energy radiating from him. The man's lips moved, but no sound came through the window. It was as if the glass itself was a barrier, blocking the communication between them. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the reflection vanished. The figure was gone. A sigh of relief passed through. Adam stood frozen, his mind spinning. He couldn't explain what he had just seen, or what was happening to him. His thoughts were a tangled mess, and every time he tried to make sense of it, the fear grew, feeding on itself. "You can't leave," the voice whispered again, closer now, almost at his ear. "Not until you understand." Adam spun around, his breath shallow, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, still as ever, but the oppressive weight of its presence pressed down on him, suffocating him. He felt trapped, unable to escape the invisible grip that held him in place. He reached for the door again, this time with more urgency. His fingers brushed the handle, but before he could turn it, a sudden force slammed him backward. He hit the wall with a sickening thud, his head spinning. Pain shot through his body, but it was nothing compared to the terror that gripped his chest. The room seemed to stretch and warp around him, the walls bending like soft clay. The bookshelves groaned, their contents shifting and rearranging themselves. The floor beneath his feet buckled, as if the house itself were alive, reshaping itself to trap him. The shadows were no longer just in the corners, they were everywhere. They seemed to move with a mind of their own, curling around him like tendrils of smoke. Adam's heart raced, his breathing erratic. He had to get out. He had to leave. But the house wasn't letting him go. It had claimed him, and it wasn't going to let him escape. The voice, soft but insistent, whispered again, this time from directly behind him. "You're not leaving. You never will." Adam spun around, his body shaking with fear, but there was nothing there. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let whatever this was consume him. But every time he tried to move, to break free from the house's grip, something pushed him back, held him in place. "You don't understand," the voice murmured, a faint laugh slipping into its tone. "This place is your prison now." The shadows in the room began to shift, forming shapes, outlines that resembled figures, figures that seemed to grow and move with a life of their own. Adam's breath caught in his throat. He could see them now, silhouettes of people, but their faces were hidden in the darkness. They reached out to him, their hands outstretched, their forms flickering in and out of focus. His pulse raced, his legs trembling beneath him. He tried to back away, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The shadows were closing in, pressing around him, and he could feel their cold fingers brushing against his skin. "No," Adam gasped, struggling to break free from their grasp. "I have to leave, please, I have to leave." "Okay." But the shadows only laughed, their voices merging into one, their words a cacophony of whispers. "You can't leave. Not until you understand. Not until you face the truth." Much of Cinder's selfishness was the result of self-made abilities. No mistake he was the master of self-study, though. The truth. Adam's mind raced. What truth? What did they want from him? The walls seemed to close in, the room growing smaller with each passing second. The shadows were all around him now, suffocating him, their whispers growing louder and more frantic. And then, in the midst of it all, one figure stepped forward, its face emerging from the darkness. It was the man, the figure he had seen in the window. But now his face was clear. It was no longer a shadow, no longer a distorted reflection. It was real. And the man's eyes, cold, empty and full of malice, locked onto Adam's with an intensity that made his blood run cold. He should have stayed away, the man said, his voice a low growl, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Adam's heart hammered in his chest, his entire body shaking as the man's cold eyes bored into him. The shadows around him seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat, each flicker of darkness amplifying the tension in the room. His thoughts scrambled, struggling to find a way out, but there was nothing, no escape. "You shouldn't have come here," the man repeated, his voice like gravel scraping against bone. His lips twisted into a cruel smile, revealing teeth that gleamed unnaturally sharp in the dim light. Adam's breath came in shallow gasps as the figure took a slow, deliberate step forward. The air grew colder, and the room seemed to shrink with each movement the man made. It felt as if the walls were closing in, the house itself suffocating him, making it harder to think, harder to breathe. "What do you want from me?" Adam choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know why he was asking. It was as if he already knew the answer, but he couldn't stop himself. The man's smile widened, but his eyes remained empty, as though there were nothing behind them, just an endless abyss. "What do I want? What do you think I want, Adam?" The use of his name sent a jolt of terror through Adam. How did he know his name? He had never seen this man before, never even stepped foot in this house until today. The questions piled up, each one more suffocating than the last, but the answers remained just out of reach, hidden in the shadows that surrounded him. "You've been chosen," the man said, his voice lowering to a sinister murmur. "You've always been meant to be here. The house knew you'd come." Adam's legs fell weak beneath him. He wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to break free from this nightmare. But the house held him in place, its invisible grip tightening with every passing second. "No," Adam whispered, shaking his head as though denying it could change anything. "I don't understand. I'm not meant to be here. I'm just a guy who got lost. This is a mistake." The man chuckled, the sound hollow and devoid of warmth. "Mistake? There are no mistakes here, Adam. Only fate." The shadows in the room began to writhe, swirling around Adam's feet, crawling up his legs like tendrils of smoke. The temperature dropped, the cold seeping into his bones, numbing him from the inside out. He felt as though the very essence of the house was wrapping itself around him, pulling him deeper into its twisted web. "No," Adam gasped again, his voice cracking. "I don't belong here. I didn't ask for this. I don't want this." The man's eyes glinted with something like pity, but colder, darker. The shadows surged, and Adam stumbled backward, his breath coming in frantic bursts. He had no idea what the man was talking about, but something deep inside him told him that the truth was worse than anything he could imagine. The house knew something about him, something he hadn't even realized himself. The walls groaned, their timbers creaking as if the house were alive, reacting to the conversation. The floor beneath Adam's feet shifted, the wooden boards warping as if the house were trying to swallow him whole. He backed away, his hands reaching for the door once more, but it remained just out of reach. The more he struggled, the tighter the house's grip became. "You're trapped, Adam," the man said, his voice low and unyielding. "And there's no escape, not from this house, not from yourself." The words hit Adam like a punch to the gut. Trapped. He had always felt trapped, hadn't he? Trapped in his own life, in his own choices, running from something he couldn't face. But what was it? What was he running from? The shadows seemed to shift in time with his racing thoughts, as if the house was responding to his internal turmoil. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing down on him like a physical weight. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. The walls closed in around him, and the whispers returned, growing louder and more frantic. You can't escape. You can't outrun what's inside you. The voice was everywhere now, filling his mind, drowning out everything else. It wasn't just the man anymore. It was the house, the darkness, his own fear. He was spiraling, unraveling, and the more he tried to resist, the more it pulled him in. "Leave," Adam whispered, his voice barely audible, his hands shaking as he pressed them against the door. "I just want to leave, please." But the house wouldn't let him go. It was suffocating him, trapping him in a prison of his own making. The man's smile twisted into something crueler, something more sinister. "You can't leave," he said softly, almost pityingly. "You never could." Adam's legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, the shadows swirling around him like a living entity. He could feel them creeping over his skin, seeping into his thoughts, into his very soul. The darkness was consuming him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The room seemed to tilt, the walls spinning around him. His head was spinning, his thoughts fractured and broken. The house was alive, and it knew him, knew everything about him. It had been waiting for him all along. However, true to his briefcase, tight-buckled pack and praying, he did not hesitate. The truth was here, and it was more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. Adam's body trembled on the cold, creaking floor as the shadows continued to swirl around him. His mind was a haze of confusion, every thought muddled by the suffocating presence of the house. The whispers were louder now, not just in his ears, but in his very bones, vibrating through him, shaking him to the core. "You can't run. You can't hide." He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the voices, but they seeped in, relentless and overwhelming. His pulse quickened, and his breath came in shallow gasps as his hands pressed harder against the wooden floor. He could feel the house, feel it watching him, feeling every tremor of his fear. "You're not alone, Adam." The man's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, deep and calm. "You never have been." Adam opened his eyes slowly, his gaze locked on the figure still standing in the corner of the room. The man's presence felt like a weight, a suffocating pressure that Adam couldn't escape. The air around him seemed to shimmer with dark energy, as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel. "What do you mean?" Adam croaked, his voice weak, barely a whisper. His throat was raw, and every word felt like it was tearing at his insides. "What are you talking about?" The man took a step closer, his silhouette shifting unnaturally in the dim light. His smile remained fixed, though there was no warmth in it, only something darker, something more sinister. "The house knows you, Adam. It knows everything about you. Your past, your regrets, your darkest fears. And it's waiting for you to face it." Adam's breath hitched, and his heart thudded painfully in his chest. His mind raced back to his childhood, to memories he had long buried. Memories of his father's anger, of his mother's cold silence, of the feeling that he was never truly wanted. Was that what the man meant? Was that what the house wanted him to face? "You've been running your whole life, haven't you?" the man continued, his voice a slow, hypnotic drawl. "Running from your past, from the truth of who you really are. You think you can escape it, but the house knows. It knows all of it." Adam shook his head, trying to clear the fog from his mind. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But the fear was too real, the pressure too overwhelming. His chest tightened, and his stomach twisted with a sickening churn. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, like the house was physically pressing down on him, suffocating him with its knowledge, mentally straining him with its body. "You think you're alone?" the man went on, his voice like a shadow crawling into Adam's ears. "But you've never been alone. The house has always been with you, Adam. It's always been inside you, waiting for the moment when you'd finally stop running." Adam relaxed back into the bed. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, as if they were reaching into the very depths of Adam's soul. His mind raced, but the more he tried to push away the thoughts, the more they seemed to sink in. The house, his father's anger, his mother's coldness, they all bled together in his mind, intertwining with the dark presence in the room. The house was a reflection of him, of everything he had tried to escape. And now there was nowhere left to run. The shadows around him seemed to shift, twisting into shapes that almost resembled faces, the faces of people he had known, people he had hurt, people he had left behind. His mind flashed to his ex-girlfriend, Jenna, the one person who had tried to pull him out of his self-imposed isolation. He had pushed her away, driven her to the point where she no longer wanted to be part of his life. "You pushed them all away," the whispers echoed in his mind, "and now you're paying the price." The man's smile grew wider, his teeth gleaming in the dim light. "You think you can leave this place, Adam? You think you can escape what's inside you? It's too late for that. The house will never let you go. It's part of you now." Adam's breath quickened, panic rising in his chest as he scrambled to his feet. His hands trembled uncontrollably, and he wiped the sweat from his brow. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He needed to get out. He needed to run. But there was no way out. Not anymore. The door, the one he had been so desperate to reach, remained just out of reach. No matter how many steps he took, it stayed the same distance away. It was as if the house itself was playing a cruel game, trapping him in a never-ending loop. "You can't escape." The whisper came from all directions now, inside his head, in his ears, in his very soul. The walls groaned, the house itself seeming to pulse with the rhythm of his racing heartbeat. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. "I don't want this. I don't want any of this." The man's eyes narrowed, and for the first time Adam saw something like pity in them. "It's not about what you want, Adam. It's about what you need. You need to face the truth. You need to confront what you've been running from." Sinessa studied him for a while. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist, converging on him like a suffocating blanket. Adam felt a surge of fear unlike anything he had ever known. He wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but the darkness had already claimed him. There was no escaping it. No escaping himself. And in that moment, Adam realized the horrifying truth. The house wasn't just a building, it was a part of him. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for Adam to finally crack, to break beneath the weight of its suffocating presence. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the shadows sounding like a sinister whisper in his ears. The man's figure loomed before him, a constant reminder of the truth he had been running from for so long. Adam's pulse thundered in his ears, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. He couldn't escape. Not from the house, not from the man, and not from the darkness inside him. It was all too much. His mind was a storm, every thought crashing into the next, drowning him in a sea of fear and guilt. "You can't hide anymore, Adam," the man said, his voice like the final nail in a coffin. "You've been running from yourself for so long, but the truth is always there, waiting to pull you back." Adam's knees buckled and he sank to the floor, his body trembling with exhaustion. His hands shook as he pressed them to his face, as though trying to block out the world, to stop the flood of memories that threatened to drown him. His father's harsh words echoed in his mind, the angry slamming of doors, the feeling of being small, of never being enough. His mother's silence, her cold gaze, the way she seemed to look right through him as if he didn't even exist. The years of feeling unwanted, of feeling invisible, all of it crashing down on him at once. "You think you've forgotten," the man said, his voice now a whisper, "but the past never leaves. It stays with you, buried deep inside, festering like an open wound. The house knows that wound. It knows exactly where to strike." Adam's breath hitched as the shadows around him seemed to grow closer, their cold tendrils wrapping around him, pulling him into the depths of his own memories. He saw himself as a child again, hiding in the corner of his room, too scared to make a sound. He saw his father's angry face, saw the fists that had struck him, saw the look of disgust in his mother's eyes as she stood by, silent, unwilling to intervene. "You are worthless. You are nothing." The words rang in his ears, a constant drumbeat of self-loathing that had haunted him for as long as he could remember. He had tried to run from them, to bury them beneath layers of distractions and empty relationships. But they were always there, lurking just beneath the surface. "No," Adam gasped, shaking his head. "No, this isn't real. It's not me. It's not who I am." "Great good." The man's face twisted into a cruel smile. "You think you're different, don't you? You think you've changed. But the truth is, Adam, you've been running from the same thing your entire life. You've been running from yourself." The shadows closed in, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. The air grew colder, the room darker, until Adam could barely see anything at all. His mind raced, trying to find an escape, a way out of the nightmare he was trapped in. But there was no escape. Not from the house, and not from the man. There was only the truth. The house had always been with him. It had always known him, understood him in a way no one else ever could. It was a reflection of everything he had tried to bury, a mirror of his own darkest thoughts and fears. "You think you can run from the past," the man continued, his voice now a low growl. "But it always catches up. It always finds you," he had said. Adam's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he struggled to push the darkness away. His body shook violently, his muscles aching with the strain. He had to escape. He had to get out. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't move. The walls seemed to close in on him, the shadows pressing in from all sides, suffocating him with their cold embrace. "You can't escape yourself." The words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, Adam realized the full weight of their meaning. The house, the man, the shadows. They were all part of him. They were manifestations of everything he had tried to hide, everything he had tried to forget. They were the truth he had been too afraid to face. "You can't keep running, Adam," the man said, his voice softening, almost pitying. "It's time to face the truth." The room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the shadows shifting and writhing like living things. Adam's heart pounded in his chest, the pressure building, squeezing the air from his lungs. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: fear, guilt, regret, anger. All of it crashing together in a tidal wave of overwhelming truth. "I can't run anymore." The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. The house wasn't his prison. It was his reflection, and the only way out was to confront what he had been avoiding all these years. With a final shuddering breath, Adam looked up at the man, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "What do I have to do?" The man's smile softened, almost as if he were proud. Face it. Face your past. Face who you really are. The shadows around him seemed to draw back, giving him space, allowing him to breathe for the first time in what felt like an eternity. But the weight of the truth was still there, pressing down on him. Adam knew what he had to do. It wasn't going to be easy and it wasn't going to be painless, but it was the only way forward. The house had already claimed him, but now it was time to reclaim himself. The house was silent now, as though holding its breath, waiting for Adam to take the next step. The shadows had receded, but their presence still lingered in the corners of the room, an ever-watchful reminder of the truth he had been running from for so long. The man, standing at the edge of the dim light, no longer felt like a threat. Instead, he was an observer, an unwilling guide, perhaps, waiting for Adam to confront what he had avoided for years. Adam's heart still hammered in his chest, but there was a clarity now, a stillness within him that had been absent moments before. He had made the decision. The time for hiding was over. The time for facing the truth was now. He stood slowly, his legs weak but determined. The room felt colder, the weight of the past pressing on him with each step he took. Every floorboard creaked underfoot, as though the house itself were whispering its secrets, revealing pieces of the puzzle he had been blind to for so long. The man watched him, his eyes steady and unwavering. There was no judgment in them now, only a quiet understanding. He wasn't here to push Adam. He was here to watch the inevitable unfold. Adam's gaze swept across the room, his eyes landing on the walls, the dark corners where the shadows had once been. He could feel them there still, the remnants of the fear, the anger, the guilt. They weren't gone, not entirely. But now, they no longer held power over him. "I'm ready," Adam whispered, though the words tasted bitter on his tongue. Noel looked up. The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "You've been running from this for a long time, Adam. But the past doesn't disappear. It's time to face it." Adam closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The memories surged forward, flooding his mind like a torrent, each one sharper, more vivid than the last. He saw himself again, as a child, standing in the doorway of his childhood home, looking at his parents with a mixture of longing and fear. He saw his father's angry face, the way his voice would rise in a furious crescendo, a storm that would break without warning. His mother's face was colder still, a silent witness to the chaos, a woman who had retreated into herself, her own pain more powerful than any words she could say. He had spent years blaming her for not protecting him, for not standing up to his father. But now, he saw it for what it truly was, a woman trapped in her own despair, a woman too broken to help anyone, least of all him. And then there were the words, the ones that had followed him through every dark corner of his life. Eli copied them all. "You're worthless. You'll never be good enough." The voices echoed through his mind, each one a bitter reminder of the way his parents had shaped him, the way they had torn him down with every cruel word, every disappointed glance, every moment of neglect. Adam's chest tightened as the weight of it all pressed down on him. But this time, he didn't look away. He didn't run. "I am not them," he thought. "I am not defined by their cruelty." The shadows in the room seemed to pulse in response to his thoughts, as though testing his resolve. But Adam stood firm, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaws set in determination. "You can't change the past," the man said softly, as though reading Adam's mind. "But you can change what it means to you." Adam turned to face him, his eyes steady. "I don't need to change the past. I need to stop letting it control me." The man's lips twitched in something that might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell in the dim light. "Then you're closer than you think." "Toro," Ross said. For a long moment, the two of them stood in silence, the weight of the past hanging between them. Adam could feel the man's gaze on him, but it didn't feel like a judgment anymore. It was just a presence, an acknowledgement of what had been, and what could still be. The shadows had receded, but they hadn't disappeared. Adam knew they would always be a part of him. They were a reflection of the pain he had lived with for so long. But they didn't have to define him. They didn't have to control him. With a deep breath, Adam took a step forward. The air in the room felt different now. Lighter, as though a veil had been lifted. He wasn't free from the past, not yet, but he was no longer trapped by it. He had faced it, and that was enough for now. The man nodded once, as if satisfied. "You've taken the first step. The rest will come in time." Adam looked around the room one last time, the house no longer feeling like a prison, but like a place of transformation. The shadows had lost their power, and for the first time in years, Adam felt something like peace. It wasn't complete, it wasn't perfect, but it was a start. He turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps steady and sure. The man didn't stop him. He didn't need to. Adam had made his choice. The past was behind him now, and the future, whatever it might hold, was his to shape. As Adam stepped out of the house, the door closing softly behind him, he took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs. The darkness no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a canvas, waiting for him to paint his own story. And for the first time in a long time, Adam believed that maybe, just maybe, he could. The night air was crisp, the sky above a dark velvet canvas dotted with stars. Adam stood on the doorstep, his breath visible in the cold air, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of his thoughts. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't running from something. He wasn't hiding from the shadows that had plagued him for so long. He was simply breathing, alive, present. The house behind him loomed, dark and silent, but it no longer felt oppressive. It had been a place of torment, a cage that had held him captive in his own memories. But now, with each step he took away from it, the grip of the past loosened. The weight that had crushed him for years was no longer as heavy, and with it, a new sense of freedom bloomed within him. Adam looked up at the stars, the distant twinkling lights filling him with a strange sense of calm. The world was vast, filled with possibilities, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he could belong in it. He wasn't defined by the horrors of his past. He was more than the broken child he had once been. He walked away from the house, the gravel beneath his boots crunching with each step. The street was quiet, the neighborhood still and peaceful, as though it too was taking a collective breath after years of turmoil. It was a simple night, but in that simplicity, Adam found something profound. As he moved further down the road, his thoughts turned to the future. He didn't know exactly what it held, but for the first time he felt like he could face it. The journey ahead would be his own to shape, and he was no longer afraid of the shadows that once haunted him. The past had been a part of him, but it no longer had the power to control him. He thought about the man, the silent figure who had watched him confront his demons. As Adam walked, the streets began to brighten. The first hints of dawn touched the horizon, the dark sky slowly giving way to a soft golden light. The world around him seemed to awaken, stretching and sighing in the warmth of the new day. Adam stopped for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun would rise soon, and with it, a new chapter of his life. He didn't know where it would lead, but he knew he would face it with open eyes and a steady heart. He had survived the darkness. And now, as the first light of day began to wash over the world, Adam understood that he had the power to shape his own story. No longer defined by the past, He was free to write his future, one step at a time. As the sun rose higher, Adam felt a sense of peace settle over him. The shadows that had once felt so heavy were gone, and in their place a new dawn had arrived, and with it, a new beginning.